Hey there. Ready to dive into a world of political intrigue and surprisingly relevant advice? Today's subject is someone you've probably heard of, but maybe haven't had the chance to fully explore. Niccolò Machiavelli.
And when we say fully explore, we mean going way beyond just The Prince, that one book everyone associates with him. Machiavelli's life, the time he lived in, and his full body of work offer a much richer perspective.
It's like thinking, a band just from their biggest hit, when they've got a whole back catalog full of hidden gems. Luckily for this deep dive, we've got a stack of sources covering everything from Machiavelli's biography to the historical context of his work.
And what we want to do is give you a much more nuanced understanding of the man and his ideas. Because Machiavellian doesn't have to be a dirty word. Well, not always a dirty word.
Challenge accepted. So first things first, who was this guy? Most people probably picture Machiavelli hunched over a desk, whispering schemes in some dimly lit palace.
It's a great visual, but the reality is much more interesting.
It's 1469. Florence is a whirlwind of political maneuvering, constantly shifting alliances, and the Medici family calling the shots.
Sounds a bit like a certain dragon-obsessed TV show, but with even better fashion. So little Niccolò is born right into the thick of it. What kind of impact did that have on him?
Imagine being practically raised on political drama. Machiavelli saw firsthand how easily power could change hands, how ruthlessly people pursued it, and the ever-present threat of violence bubbling under the surface.
Talk about formative years. But you mentioned something earlier about him not actually being allowed to hold high office himself.
Exactly. Due to some complicated citizenship rules at the time, Machiavelli couldn't actually climb the political ladder himself. It's almost ironic this incredibly insightful observer of power denied the very thing he wrote so much about.
Wow, so he's like the ultimate political outsider analyzing the game from the sidelines. I bet that gave him a unique perspective.
Absolutely. He was both a product of this tumultuous world and someone who could view it with a certain amount of detachment. He was taking notes, and those notes would become some of the most influential and controversial ideas in Western thought.
Which brings us to the elephant in the room, or maybe the lion in the library, given our subject, the prince. That title alone has become synonymous with cunning ambition and maybe a little moral flexibility.
It's true. For many, the prince, I.S. Machiavelli, and it definitely contains some, let's call them pragmatic ideas about acquiring and maintaining power.
But you're suggesting there's more to the story. That reducing Machiavelli to just that one book is missing a big part of the picture.
Think of it this way. Assuming a chef only knows one recipe doesn't make them a very good chef.
Okay.
Machiavelli was a multifaceted thinker. And to really get him, we have to look at his other works, like the Discourses on Livy.
Okay, so what's the counterpoint then? What does he argue in the discourses that challenges that power at all costs image?
The Discourses are all about republics, governments, where power rests with elected officials, not hereditary rulers. And what's fascinating is that Machiavelli passionately argues for their strengths, for how they thrive on civic virtue participation, and even a certain level of internal conflict.
Wait, did you say positive aspects of conflict? That doesn't sound very Machiavellian, at least not in the way we usually use the word.
Right. It's one of the big surprises you find when you dig deeper. Machiavelli actually argued that a healthy dose of conflict, think different factions with different interests, could be incredibly beneficial for a republic.
So not just chaos for chaos's sake, but a way of preventing any one group from becoming too powerful, too dominant.
Exactly. He saw how factionalism, if left unchecked, could tear a republic apart. But he also recognized its potential to foster debate, compromise, and ultimately a more stable and balanced form of government.
So he's basically laying the groundwork for checks and balances centuries before the Founding Fathers made it a thing.
You got it. And it makes you wonder, was he secretly pro-republic this whole time? Or did he simply see different tools for different situations? Understanding that the path to a stable society, whether a monarchy or a republic, wasn't always a straight line.
Now that is a question I'd love to ask him, because it highlights this fascinating tension that runs through a lot of his work. On one hand, you've got these hard-nosed tactics for seizing and holding power, but then you've also got moments where he's almost celebrating Republican ideals.
It's a puzzle, for sure, and one that scholars are still debating today. But that, my friend, is exactly what makes Machiavelli so endlessly intriguing.
I'm starting to think we need a whole new vocabulary for talking about this guy. Machiavellian, as we typically use it, just doesn't seem to cover it. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk about those rules we keep mentioning. Because for Machiavelli, even morality seems to be up for debate, right?
Yes, the million-dollar question. Was Machiavelli truly a teacher of evil, as some have labeled him? Or was he simply a pragmatist, a keen observer of human nature who dared to describe the world as it was not as we wished it to be.
It's like he's holding up this mirror to human nature, flaws and all, and some people just couldn't handle the reflection.
He definitely sparked a debate that's still going strong centuries later. And it's true that some of Machiavelli's suggestions, let's call them, fall into a bit of a gray area morally. But were those genuine endorsements of evil or just an honest assessment of how power actually works in the real world?
Huge difference. So where do we even begin to untangle that? Are there any specific parts of his work where this whole "was he really that bad" debate comes up the most?
Oh, absolutely. His views on Christianity, for example, were pretty unconventional for the time.
Unconventional how? Was he just not into the whole turn the other cheek thing when it came to ruling a country?
It's a bit more nuanced than that. Machiavelli never outright rejected religion, but he did see it as sometimes clashing with his ideas about what made for a strong leader and a stable society.
Okay, so spill the tea. What was Machiavelli's big and probably controversial take on religion?
He felt that Christianity, while maybe promoting admirable qualities in individuals, could actually be a disadvantage for a ruler trying to maintain order and control. Humility, forgiveness, turning the other cheek, those aren't exactly traits that scream powerful leader, especially in the ruthless world of 16th century politics.
I guess blessed are the peacemakers doesn't quite have the same ring to it when you're trying to run a kingdom.
Exactly. Machiavelli believed those Christian ideals could make people too passive in the face of power. He looked to the classical world, think ancient Greece and Rome, for inspiration. He admired qualities like ambition, the drive to achieve, and even a touch of ruthlessness when it came to leadership.
So it's less about being a saint and more about getting things done, even if it means playing a little rough. Definitely a different perspective.
It does challenge our modern sensibilities. But again, it comes back to Machiavelli's emphasis on being realistic. He was constantly trying to figure out what it really took to govern effectively, especially in a time when it felt like everyone was making up the rules as they went along.
He's like, stop wishing for a perfect world and start figuring out how to survive in this one. Which actually leads us to another biggie, fate versus free will. I get the sense Machiavelli was not about to let some cosmic coin toss decide his destiny.
Spot on. He firmly believed in taking control of your own future, not just passively accepting whatever fate throws at you. He even had a name for it, virtue.
Virtue, and I'm guessing this goes beyond just being a good person.
You could say that. Think of it more as a combination of skill, talent, strategic cunning, even ruthlessness when necessary. It's about having the guts and the smarts to shape the world according to your own vision, not the other way around,
Less about following the Ten Commandments and more about writing your own.
essentially. And this was radically different from the more traditional views of his time. Back then, people often saw fate or divine will as the driving force behind events. Machiavelli looked around at the chaos and said, nope, we have a say in this.
Talk about a power move. It's almost as if he's grabbing the pen from Destiny's hand and saying, I'll write my own story. But this all bugs the question, did Machiavelli actually live by his own rules? Was he out there conquering the world with his virtue?
That's where the historical record gets a bit fuzzy. We know he had ambitions beyond his bureaucratic roles, but despite his best efforts, he never achieved the level of political power he seemed to crave.
So did Machiavelli get Machiavellian? That's kind of poetically ironic, if you think about it.
Right. It's almost Shakespearean. He experienced firsthand how fickle power can be, the very thing he wrote so much about.
Tragedy, comedy, maybe a little bit of both. I have a feeling Machiavelli would appreciate the irony of it all. But speaking of irony, we've spent a lot of time on how Machiavelli viewed the world. What about how the world viewed him? What kind of lasting legacy did his ideas leave behind?
Well, I think the very word Machiavellian itself is a testament to his lasting impact. But how did we go from a political theorist to the go-to adjective for describing every cunning, scheming character in books, movies, and real life? And more importantly, is that reputation entirely deserved?
Right. Because we've already seen that he was more than just a one-dimensional villain advocating for power at all costs.
Absolutely. It's a reduction of his ideas that Machiavelli himself probably would have found both amusing and frustrating. He was a product of a specific time and place, and his work needs to be understood in that context.
So, more than just a historical figure, he becomes this lens for looking at how power works, both then and now.
Exactly. And to really get at his legacy, we need to think about the context in which his ideas spread. This was the dawn of the printing press. Within a few decades, his writings were everywhere, being read by kings, queens, revolutionaries.
And probably a few actual villains along the way, let's be real. But seriously, what kind of impact did this have on the way people thought about power and politics?
It was seismic. Here you have this previously obscure Florentine official suddenly thrusting this radically realistic, some might even say cynical, view of politics onto the world stage. He challenged centuries of philosophical tradition, much of which seemed detached from the often messy reality of human behavior.
He was like the original political disruptor, not just observing the game, but rewriting the rules entirely.
Exactly. And while some were horrified by his ideas, and believe me, there were plenty who were, his impact is undeniable.
It's like the old saying, you can love him, you can hate him, but you can't ignore him. And Machiavelli definitely made it hard to ignore him.
No kidding. And his influence pops up in the most unexpected places. Even the founding fathers of the United States, those champions of liberty and virtue, were surprisingly well-versed in Machiavelli's work.
Wait, seriously, the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness founding fathers. What on earth did they get from a guy who seemed to advocate for a, let's just say, a flexible approach to morality?
It's fascinating, isn't it? And it speaks to the idea that even the most devoted advocates for Republican ideals couldn't completely ignore the realities that Machiavelli so bluntly laid out. They were witnessing firsthand just how fragile new systems of government could be, and how easily those high-minded ideals could crumble when faced with internal divisions and external threats.
So they were taking notes on both the idealism of building a new nation, AD, the pragmatism of navigating the world of power politics.
Precisely. They saw the value in civic virtue, but they also understood that sometimes you needed a little of that Machiavellian savvy to survive in the rough-and-tumble world of politics.
A little virtue tucked away in their pockets, right next to those copies of Locke and Montesquieu. I love it. It's a good reminder that governing, whether you're talking about 16th century Florence or 18th century America, often demands a balance between lofty ideals and the messy reality of human nature.
Absolutely. And perhaps no one understood, or at least articulated, that messy reality better than Machiavelli himself.
Talk about a crash course in real politic. But with all this talk of legacy and influence, it feels like we're dancing around the question that's been lurking in the background this whole time. Was Machiavelli really as evil as his reputation suggests?
Ah, yes. The million-dollar question. And thankfully, it's not one we need to answer definitively today.
Probably for the best. We'd be here for another 5 episodes trying to unpack that one.
Exactly. But it is a conversation worth continuing, long after this deep dive is over. What I will say is this.
Don't leave us hanging. What's the takeaway here? How should we grapple with this question of Machiavelli's morality?
I think the real value in exploring Machiavelli isn't about deciding if he was a saint or a sinner. It's about wrestling with the questions he raises. He forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about power, the constant push and pull between our ideals and our actions, and the choices we make when those two things collide.
So less about putting Machiavelli on trial and more about holding up a mirror to ourselves.
Precisely. His work isn't just some historical artifact. It's a lens through which we can examine our own political landscape, our own relationship with power, and our own choices in a world where the lines of right and wrong aren't always so clear.
Which is why he's so much more than just a historical figure or a synonym for ruthless ambition. He gives us a framework for understanding the complexities of power, the challenge of balancing our ideals with the reality of human nature, and the choices we all make in navigating that space.
Well said. And that brings us to what I think is a truly thought-provoking question. Something to ponder as we wrap up our deep dive today.
It is with it.
If Machiavelli were alive today, what would he say about our world? What would he make of our 24/7 news cycle, the influence of social media, the way power operates on a global scale?
Man, what would he say? Would he be horrified? Fascinated? Secretly running a political strategy consultancy firm? The possibilities are endless.
And maybe even more intriguing, what would you ask him? What insights would you seek from the man who dared to look power in the eye and tell us without flinching what he saw?
Now that is a deep dive for another day. A huge thanks to you for walking us through the world of Machiavelli and helping us understand him in a whole new light.
My pleasure. It's always exciting to explore these ideas with someone who's just as curious about the past as they are about the present.
And to you, dear listener, thanks for joining us on this journey. Don't forget to check out the show notes for more information and resources to keep the conversation going. Until next time, keep those minds sharp and remember a little. Virtue never hurt anybody. Well, maybe just a little.